Thank you all for coming. I'm Suzanne Wuns. I'm the Executive Director of the Law School Library. And we are very pleased to have here today with us to discuss the newest book from Professor Glenn Cohen and his co-editors, Identified versus Statistical Lies, an Interdisciplinary Perspective. And we have all three editors here for our panel, so it should be a very good talk. We have Professor I. Glenn Cohen, Professor of Law at HLS and Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law, Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. Professor Norman Daniels, the Mary B. Saltonstall Professor of Population Ethics and Professor of Ethics and Population Health in the Department of Global Health and Population at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And also from the Harvard T. Chan School of Public Health is Professor Nir Eyal, Associate Professor of Global Health and Social Medicine at the Harvard Medical School as well. So I'd like to thank the Petrie-Flom Center for today's wonderful lunch, and I hope you all will take time to enjoy it. And the Petrie-Flom Center is also helping to support the raffle that we're having at the end for 4 copies of today's book. And if you have a slip and need to drop it off, they go into the glass vase there in the back, and there are also some blank slips there if you haven't gotten a raffle slip yet. And we'll raffle those off at the end of the talk. Great. And the Coop is also here selling copies if you don't win one. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to Professor Cohen. Or is actually
Professor Eyal.
Okay.
Thank you. Hand it over to the mic. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah? Thank you, everybody, for coming. This book is a collection of articles about something that we call the identified person effect, or the identified person bias. In a word, there is a documented greater human inclination to assist and avoid harming people identified as at high risk of great harm, much more than there is an inclination to assist or to avoid harming people or groups who will suffer or already suffer similar harm, but are not identified or not identified as yet. I'll try to give you a sense of what we have in mind by this. This is a discussion, identified versus statistical persons, that started, took on seriously in the 1960s, involving as a central actor Charles Fried from HLS. And a few years ago, Norm Daniels, one of our co-editors, started an article on this, which spurred, I think, a lot of the recent interest in this topic, with this example of baby Jessica. Looking around the room, I assume that much less than 50% of you know or were even born when baby Jessica fell into a well in her parents' backyard. But it was a big thing, and donations poured in from all over the United States to help that girl get out of that well. There was a very complex operation to rescue her, and on the right you can see her photo graduating from college just a few years ago. Is it likely that Americans would have donated voluntarily these amounts in order to prevent such things from happening in the first place? Suppose some whiz kid calculated that that would have been more cost effective, save more babies per dollar. Would we have that inclination? Probably not. So that was just an empirical observation, a descriptive or observation or speculation about our psychology. But it's interesting, and it raises some ethical questions. If Americans are indeed the way I described them, does that mean that Americans are irrational? If everybody is like that, not just American, what should we make of this? Is this a bias towards identified persons in some bad sense of bias? Something that is an embarrassing fact about us? One of the things that make us only boundedly rational? Or is it just something about us, and it's perfectly respectable normatively? It makes sense. Check out some other contexts where this arises. This is a set of photographs that Partners in Health uses a lot. There's one of their patients in Haiti, and treatment can raise people from the dead. The same person a little later, after he was treated by them. When Jim Kim presents these 2 pictures, he often says that when he shows these 2 pictures to donors and he says he even got his belly back, the hand goes to the pocket. People cannot resist what he calls the Lazarus effect. People find it much, much easier to resist giving their dollars to prevention, even to prevention that some people at least suspect is more cost effective than providing antiretrovirals for life and hoping that people don't develop resistance. Something like male circumcision. There is no before and after interesting photos if somebody did the right thing to prevent and then continued to remain negative, and it's not as moving for us. So is this irrational on our parts? We're just stupid, we don't understand the correct way to address the scourge of HIV? We would use our dollars more wisely if we did it otherwise, if we invested everything in prevention and left nothing for treatment unless shown that treatment is more cost effective but a certain margin? Or does it make sense morally not to send away somebody who was already infected, for whom investing in prevention will no longer help? Because they're a human being, and there's something important morally about not saying no in those moments. Somebody's identified as at high risk. The cost-effective thing will happen at their expense. And it makes sense, and it's perfectly defensible morally, to refuse to just invest in cost-effectiveness, but also to keep some budget for this response to an identified individual. It's not as though the individual is poorer or necessarily sicker than the people who we would be preventing from becoming sicker, but it still makes sense in some other way that we should flesh out. That's a position that one could take. So the question is whether it would be ethical to deny people who are already infected intervention that helps them so that we can save more lives. And part, at least, of the impetus to not deny them that help is has to do with something like the identified person effect or bias. The way we allocate lungs in this country specifically has something to do, it seems, with that bias. This is how we calculate who to prioritize among the patients in the waiting list for lungs. So once you're listed, we use various proxies in the US to identify two values. Your prognosis, your chance of survival, if you will. It's a little inaccurate, but roughly, the chance of survival if you don't get the next lung, and your chance of survival, your prognosis, if you do get the next lung. And rather than just hand the next lung to the person for whom the gap is widest, so that if you expand this over a population, we will have made the most difference, we will have done the utilitarian thing, if you will, we give some extra weight to people who will do really, really badly if they don't get the lung. And it's a lot of extra weight. It's basically double counting. It's huge extra weight. So we have a very strong bias in favor of people who are at very, very high risk and great strife right now, unless they get our help. That may have to do with something like the identified person bias. I know that this person is already in need, and the question is whether I'm going to do the most cost-effective thing, the most utilitarian thing, or I'm going to give something for people like them, have some extra weighting or quota or something that would help them. I don't know what's your position on funding for rare disease drugs. These drugs that serve only very few patients naturally need to be much more expensive for the drug companies to make the profits they want to make and even to recuperate their costs. And this case arose in Norway just recently. This child has a particular genetic mutation that causes CF, cystic fibrosis, sorry, for which a certain drug is very effective. So if you have that very rare genetic mutation, we're talking about something like 8 or 9 patients like that in Norway, the drug, it's called, I think, avacaftor, is really, really effective at improving your lung function. So that maybe you will not be one of those who need the lung from the previous slide, but in order to live. But it's very, very expensive. We're talking about, there are some estimates coming from the UK that put the cost per quality adjusted life year, it's a measure of kind of health impact, at anything between £335,000 and £1,274,000. Just to give you a sense of what that means, it's anywhere, I think it's something like I don't have the number here, but I calculated at home, it's like something like 20 times above the thresholds that anybody is envisaging would make sense for funding any drug. So there was a committee in Norway, they planned to deny this child this drug, but this article appeared in a major newspaper, huge public pressure, and immediately the minister said, of course, we're going to buy this child, this 3-year-old Sondre, the drug, and identified child who can withstand that pressure. So should that have happened, or was that very inappropriate because we should be kind of the economists about this, or should we be the bleeding heart physicians about this who want to help their patients and things like that? What is the right approach? The book tries to address this. We are delighted. This is the first time that I'm seeing it. We have more copies here. And we are delighted also to have some of our contributors, including Dan Brock, in whose honor we dedicated this book. Dan is somebody who worked with some of us and mentored some of us, and we all are extremely fond of Dan and extremely grateful to the many, many services and lessons that we learned from him over decades.
Dan is now enjoying his retirement.
So the book comes in 3 parts. First part is about the social science of all this. So trying to describe this tendency that we have, if indeed we have it, better. What exactly, I've just given you very broad brush descriptions of that effect, but what exactly sparks that effect? Is it that when you see a photo, you see the face? Does it arise even when there is no photo? Turns out, yes, it does arise. That you don't need the moral schmaltz in order to make it happen. Even when we hear that some individual, not always very specific identifiers, sometimes even something like an arbitrary number you give them, is the one who will suffer, is the one who is at high risk, that sparks a lot of the effect. So there are attempts to characterize that effect better. The main part of the book is an ethical discussion or an ethical debate. There are people on 2 sides of that debate, Dan and others, including myself, who are a little skeptical about the normative force of that debate. So we are largely of the camp that says that there is something irrational about that debate. And others, including, to some degree, Caspar Hare from MIT. Do you want to raise your hand, who kindly joined us today? A philosopher. And Norm Daniels, one of our editors, and others who are much less skeptical about the debate. And you'll hear in a minute from Norm why he takes that, why they're much less skeptical about the bias, the effect. They treat it with much more respect. You'll hear from Norm why he treats it with that respect. And there is a third part, which is more about application. It includes 2 essays by law professors. One of them is our co-editor, Glenn Cohen, who will discuss in a couple minutes his contribution. And another is by Lisa Hanserling, who discusses the impact of that bias in environmental law. So you might think that in environmental law, it's the paradigm area where we look only at statistical persons, and therefore, so who knows who will be affected by the smoke that you emit. It's not identified, so you might think, given that bias, that environmental law would be not very stringent, because we have that bias in favor of identified individuals, but it turns out, she says, it's surprisingly very stringent. So how can we make sense of that? There are also articles about treatment versus prevention, and a debate about treatment as prevention, recent intervention against HIV and potentially other diseases. So I shall, at this point, turn to Glenn.
Great. Thank you, Derek.
I think I'm just going to sit down for mine.
Right. Do you need the microphone?
No, I think we've got some over here. I also want to just thank the Harvard Global Health Institute, who sponsored the original conference. A bunch of other people were involved in the original conference, and they're thanked in the acknowledgement. So the final part of this book is about application. We've got a bunch of chapters, as Nir said, on HIV/AIDS in particular as an area of application where this is a real decision maker for funders and for policymakers. Lisa has a great chapter on environmental law, which suggests, as you might think, that environmental law, all statistical lives, so we don't care about it as much, but she actually shows that statistical lives have taken on a life of their own, if you will, in environmental law. I'm going to talk about something that sounds like it won't be very related, but it actually is, and that is questions of justiciability and civil procedure. So, suppose a government official in charge of proposing legislation regulating the coal industry is presented with the following analysis. If you pass an amendment to a certain existing environmental law to prohibit the use of a certain form of coal burning nationwide, 10,000 fewer kids will develop asthma, although there's a cost to the industry. Okay, so this is a classical statistical lives case. We know that 10,000 kids in America somewhere will benefit, but we don't know who they are. And by the way, those of you who are too young for baby Jessica, you might remember the Simpsons episode of We're Sending Our Love Down a Well, right? Which is a play on this, which has a great We Are the World parody. So if it's correct that there should be no premium attached to identified lives versus statistical lives, as some in this book argue, then as a policy matter, the government official should be indifferent between this policy and one that prevented the same harm for identified lives. For example, a policy that provides devices that filtered the pollutants involved from coal burning through air filters for 10,000 specific children currently covered by a healthcare program and prevented their development from asthma. Because identified lives, statistical lives, they're all lives. That's the idea. But even if the policymaker thought about it that way, that doesn't mean that our litigation system thinks about it that way. To continue with the above example, suppose the legislation discussed had not passed and someone wanted to challenge the existing environmental law, which permits the coal burning, based on the fact that it's going to result in 10,000 more asthmatic children. Who could bring that claim, and when could they bring that claim? From the environment to discrimination, some of the most important gains and losses in public policy are achieved through litigation. Even the credible threat of a lawsuit can be a major tool in leveraging the opponents into changing their position. Thus, the availability or lack thereof of a litigation route is crucially important in thinking about social change. But this chapter is about the way in which statistical lives figure into the question of when you can bring litigation. So first, I want to argue that two doctrines commonly employed by courts, that law students will know all about, but some of the doctors and other people in the room might not, help to determine whether a controversy can be heard at a present moment, the standing of the individual plaintiffs and the ripeness of the dispute, press litigants to frame their claims on the basis of identified lives rather than statistical lives. What do I mean by that? So one element of the standing requirement that's most relevant for us is that we often say you have to suffer an injury in fact, an invasion of a legally protected interest, which is concrete and particularized, actual or imminent, not conjectural or hypothetical. Let me give one famous example, which is the Lujan case, remains the standard citation on the Supreme Court for this aspect of standing doctrine. You have the Defenders of Wildlife organization challenging the government's authority to require under the Endangered Species Act any action funded by the Department of Interior and Commerce does not jeopardize the continuing existence or habitat of an endangered or threatened species. Prior administrations had interpreted that to include actions taken abroad, but the then current administration interpreted it as only covering actions taken domestically. This group, the Defenders of Wildlife, they sued, and they wanted an injunction specifying that the new interpretation was erroneous, and the older interpretation, the more expansive one, was the correct one. Well, the Supreme Court said we're not even going to get to the merits of that question because the Defenders of Wildlife lack standing. The desire to use or observe an animal species, even for purely aesthetic purposes, they say, is undeniably a cognizable interest for the purpose of standing, but the injury in fact test requires more than that. It requires that the party seeking review be himself among the injured. Be himself among the injured. So to successfully bring the claim, they said the plaintiffs had to submit affidavits or other evidence showing that through specific facts, not only that the listed species were in fact being threatened by funded activities, but that one or more of the organization's members would be directly affected apart from their special interest. And it pointed to things like, show me that you bought a train ticket or a plane ticket to go to the affected area. Show me the receipts for your hotel stay, right? These are the kinds of things they said are required to find that there's standing. So the court's emphasis on picking out specific members who could show with specific facts the direct effect on their special interests in the damage to the species creates significant difficulties for standing on behalf of statistical lives. Because if you're a statistical life, you are by definition not somebody who's been identified at this point. So there is no easy way to bring a claim on standing for statistical lives. The second doctrine is the notion of ripeness. So standing is about who can bring a claim, whereas ripeness is about when someone can bring a claim. Also has its roots in Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, but also a prudential concern. We ask whether an injury that has not yet happened is sufficiently likely to happen to warrant judicial review. And the roots and motivation of this doctrine is against prohibition against advisory opinions. So the doctrine has obvious implications for identified versus statistical lives. To return to our example of the coal policy, when could the action is challenged? When it's passed, though the ultimate negative effect thus far on identified lives might be years away, or only when the injury becomes concrete. Policy decisions relating to considerations of identified versus statistical lives frequently have this kind of temporal feature. We are making a decision at time 1 that will have effects at time 2, and time 2 may be further along the way, much further temporally speaking. And by prohibiting unripe claims from being litigated, we again create problems for statistical lives. And let me just give you one example from the Supreme Court's jurisprudence. In the Socialist Labor Party versus Gilligan, a case from '72, the plaintiff sought to challenge the constitutionality of the Ohio election law requiring a loyalty oath that all political parties file an affidavit stating under oath that the party is not engaged in an attempt to overthrow the government and does not carry on sedition or treason as defined by the criminal law. The court refused to reach the merits of the question of whether you could constitutionally do this because they said the federal courts do not decide abstract questions posed by parties who lack a personal stake in the outcome. The record was extraordinarily skimpy about admitting facts that would enable us to adjudicate the claim. And the usual cases, they said, in which this court has passed on validity of similar oath provisions, the party challenging the constitutionality was either unable or unwilling to execute the required oath in the circumstance of the particular case. Here they said we know very little about the operation of the Ohio affidavit procedure, and if a prospective plaintiff who had never set foot in Ohio simply picked this section of the Ohio election law out of the statute and booked and filed a complaint in the district court, it would be the same thing as these plaintiffs, they said. So again, the requirement of concreteness, imminence, and the like also cuts against the notion that statistical lives can proceed in court and bring claims. Okay, so the first part of the chapter is to create this problem. The second half of the chapter is to examine a way in which the class action device is a possible partial solution. And the way it does this, I want to propose, or we can understand this, is it has an intermediate notion between identified and statistical lives that we can call a representative life. So you take one life that is identified and you treat it as a stand-in for the statistical lives that may no longer or not yet be identified. They may not even be lives in being yet, right? And the idea is that the class action replaces your actual day in court with a representative day in court, and there's a series of rules captured in Rule 23 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure and other doctrine around it that is meant to make the representative life congruent to those statistical lives. Now, it's only a partial salve because you still need at least one identified life in terms of bringing the class action to begin with. For example, in a case, Wilmington firefighters, all present or future uniformed employees of the city of Wilmington who took the 1985 promotional exam or who are eligible for future promotional exams, yada, yada, yada. That is a statistical life, future lives not yet in being. And yet, one firefighter who's actually taking the exam can stand in for those people. Okay. Last thing I want to say is this is a partial solution. It helps us get statistical lives in court, but it's a solution that's under increasing pressure by the U.S. Supreme Court's jurisprudence on class actions, in particular the requirement of commonality and how common the claims have to be under the Walmart case, a recent decision. So all this is just to say that we have these two spheres. As a policy matter, statistical lives can matter, and we do think about them in life. But actually, when it comes to litigation, there's a strong pressure to bring litigation on behalf of identified lives, such that the litigation route might just by its structure, not intending to enter into this debate, but in effect may enter this debate in a way that undermines the ability to bring litigation in favor of statistical lives. Let me stop there. Do you want the clicker, Norman? I think Peter has it still.
So,
Yeah, give us a,
I'll go over there.
and give him the,
Sure.
let's do.
It's not on. Well, thank you all for coming. I wanted to just give a little bit of background to my interest in this question. When I first was being interviewed by, in 2001, I would guess, or early 2002, I was asked a question, what would you like to work on as an issue? And I said I would like to work on the identified versus statistical lives problem. I didn't get to work on it for about 7 years after being hired. And I first worked on it in the first sabbatical I had at Harvard. And this conference grew out of the paper that emerged from that work. So what I'm going to take you through is one of the central arguments in that paper. I did a lot of literature review in thinking about the problem of identified lives and statistical lives. And much of the early literature on this was a literature that came out of a consequentialist framework, particularly a utilitarian framework. In general, the arguments were against giving any moral weight to identified lives. So those, and we've heard some of the reasons for doing that. But there was, to my surprise, a significant body of literature, at least two leading articles, one by Alan Gibbard and another by, so a little earlier by McKee and Richardson, arguing that if you expand the problem beyond how many lives are you saving to what are the other effects of intervening, you might have a range of externalities of any intervention that need to be accommodated in the calculation of what the effects are. And in the McKee and Richardson argument, the argument was basically, well, people feel a certain way about saving identified victims or identified lives, and that ought to be accommodated. People will feel worse if you abandon them. Gibbard argued abandoning the identified lives might create a dehumanization, and this effect on people would be very serious. So he didn't think that was very likely, so he didn't put his own weight behind this argument, but he did think there was an argument. And what I walked away from is thinking that consequentialists disagree, and the framework for their disagreement is how narrowly they construe the effects. Are they looking at the lives saved, or are they looking at other effects? And one of the other effects that might happen on either Gibbard's or McKee's view is that if people are seriously affected by this, then over time they would intervene less to save statistical lives if they were dehumanized and brutalized in various ways. So it's not even clear what the framing of the argument should be. What lives do you save over a long term or over a short term? Most of the cases specify a specific number of lives that would be at risk and are at risk among the statistical lives. So the other side of the philosophical debate is what are the non-consequentialist arguments? Taking the difference between the consequentialists and non-consequentialists as an important divide in contemporary work in ethics. So the non-consequentialist position would, in effect, at least on the con side, people who are against giving any moral weight to identified lives, say that discrimination on the basis of morally irrelevant considerations shows a lack of respect for persons. And we've heard that. The pro side of the argument, what do you take as a measure of identification? It becomes an important empirical question. So I looked at the social science literature and focused on what Jenny and Lowenstein picked out as the important effect that they identified as a specific trigger for the identified victim effect, identified life effect, namely concentration of risk. In the identified lives, all the risk is in the lives that are identified. In the statistical lives, it's spread over a group, and how large a group it is and would determine what the risk level is for individuals. So I thought it reasonable to ask the question from a non-consequentialist perspective, is the risk concentration ever morally relevant? And that was the question that motivated this paper, and I thought I should follow what was identified in the philosophical literature by my colleague Frances Cam, who was at the philosophy department here and the Kennedy School. She just articulated a strategy for identifying when something might be morally relevant. Namely, you need what she called fully equalized cases. When are you looking at the same effects in two cases? And then if something is morally relevant, you're asking the question, under some circumstances, could this ever be a factor that you take into account? You're not trying to prove that they always matter. What I constructed using this strategy was a gradation of thought experiments, which we might call the pill case or pill cases. So imagine a first case in which there's no intervention, and we have the following situation, that one person, Alice, dies for certain. And this is abstracting from what if some unforeseen event happens and she doesn't die, or forget that. We're just talking about the hypothesis that she dies and that it's certain. On the other hand, Betty, Kathy, Dolly, and Fanny are 5 of her friends who've been exposed to this illness by her, but they're at a very early stage where an intervention using 1/5 of the dose, one of the 5 pills you might give Alice that would save her life in the options, would actually prevent each of their deaths. So you're vaccinating them against this. And this abstracts from some statistical variations that you might encounter. So my colleagues at School of Public Health are very upset by this hypothetical example because it abstracts from some of the calculations they might make. But it's the kind of thought experiment that philosophers are likely to engage in. The conclusion I draw is that one person is saved out of each of these possible inventions. And what is driving my intuition, I don't know if you share it, that it's more important to save Alice than it is to vaccinate the 5 others. And you can say, well, what if you know that one of them is going to die? Don't you want to prevent that chance of death? And the conclusion I came to was that each of those people is at a 1/5 chance of death, and they're better off than Alice, who is facing death with certainty. She will definitely die. And it's more important to, she has the stronger claim on assistance than the others do, because their claim is based on their only having a 1/5 chance of death. And so my view is that under these specific circumstances, very hypothetical, and one important qualification is that I'm abstracting from the common context in which the identified life case is raised. Namely, we're saving this one identified life, but we are sacrificing many statistical lives. So it's a one-many case. And I'm saying it's a 1-1 case, at least in a 1-1 case, one ought to give more weight to the identified life. And I refrain from saying anything about aggregating this effect across others. So I want to abstract from our aggregation features. One of the papers in the volume by Johann Frick, who just graduated last year from the philosophy department here and is now at Princeton, extends this argument to thinking about aggregation as cases as well. And I would urge any of you interested in this line of argument to look at his paper as well. Now, you might think there's an artifact in that I focused too much on the 1/5 chance of death. So what if we make the chances very small? And you might be moved to say, well, 1/5 is a very significant chance of death. So what if we reduced it? And we could make it 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, or imagine that you could give Alice 100 times the dosage you give as a vaccination dose. So suppose she needed 100 pills of whatever this medication is that would rescue her from death. Or we could vaccinate each of the 5, and we can frame the problem in such a way that transmission is not possible, and there are no further deaths that you're going to avoid, and so on. And so you still have the one person versus one person. You're still dealing with that. And now the issue is, nevertheless, if 1/5 was already too much risk, does 1/100th or 1,000th of the risk of death, or 1/1,000,000th of a risk of death matter? And there's going to be some place along that line of in which you find the level of risk still significant, but you would make the judgment, or at least I'm assuming you would make the judgment, that Alice has a stronger claim. And if Alice has a stronger claim, we ought to listen to that strength of claim and rescue Alice. And that would, on this view, lead us to conclude that under some conditions, maybe very hypothetical ones, there is some moral force to the identified victim case that ought to be granted. So that was the conclusion I drew. And in the paper, what I argue is reasonable people are going to disagree about this, as I suggested, and therefore we need a process for adjudicating disputes in public. I didn't want to go into the details of that process or whether it's adequate and so on. I simply wanted to sketch the argument. Thank you.
So I'm going to argue briefly that. Hear me? Does that work? Yeah. I'm going to argue briefly that identified persons don't have an extra claim on us as such. Using trolleys. This is running away. Okay, don't stop running away. Okay, stop there. Okay. And here is the example. So philosophers like to talk about trolleys. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that kind of construction, but turns out that there is a runaway trolley that is headed, oh dear, towards one of 100 branches. I think they should all be coming from, at one point it will split into 100. Okay, at just one point. This is slightly inaccurate there. At that point, it will hit just one person. Now, often when philosophers talk about trolley examples, there is something that you can do, like throw somebody on the track. Nothing you can do to stop this. It's a very tragic trolley variant that we're discussing today. Somebody will die today. One person only will die today, because the trolley will hit just one person. You don't know who that person is. There is just one thing that you can do, and I'm going to ask you whether you think that you should do this. You can activate a roulette such that instead of the one unknown person, you don't know who that is, right? Instead of that person, it might be somebody else. It will make it objectively open again. Who will die today? Instead of somebody you don't know, maybe somebody else you don't know. Should you activate that trolley? Now, this is not adhering to Francis's other things being equal condition. I don't like that condition. I'm going to impose a slight cost on you if you insist on activating the roulette. And we can discuss during the questions why I think that the correct way to do thought experiments is actually without other things being equal, but rather with a tiny cost. You pay something for insisting not to shoot the Indian in the famous Jim and the Indians example, and I think that's the correct way to go. You should pay something of moral importance. And here's the story. Here, you were just on your way to delivering Advil to the neighbor's little toddler. Toddler is standing there and waiting, and they have a headache, and they don't understand why their headaches, and you really wanted to deliver the Advil. It's something small, it's a headache, it's not a big thing, but it's not costless to activate the roulette. You can't you can't say, yeah, let's activate it, because some people, there's some reasonable disagreement, and while I don't see the force, somebody else does. I'll err on the side of moral safety, and I'll, sure, activate it. You pay a little price for it, because the child will not get rid of the headache 10 minutes earlier. It will happen 10 minutes later. So I'm going to poll this distinguished crowd. Who thinks that they should activate the roulette, and who thinks that they should not? Who thinks that they should activate the roulette at the cost of making the child wait? Who thinks that they should rush to help the child get rid of the headache and not activate the roulette? Okay, I think you saw the results. The majority says don't bother activating the roulette. Now here's another variant. An announcement goes on. You hear the following announcement. The trolley will now head to branch number 26. The trolley will now head to branch number 26. That's very credible because you know the announcements here. It's going to be the person on branch 26. They are identified now in a very minimal way. Does that make you want to activate the trolley? Who would now activate the trolley? Who would rush to save the child from the headache? So in both cases, you decided to not be moved by the higher risk for an individual. My analogy is to Alice, who is at higher risk, right? So there is somebody, but in the first instance, you didn't know who it is. In the second one, you actually knew who it is. It wasn't called, Alice. It was called the person on branch 26. I don't know if that should make a difference. I think according to norms theory, it should not make a difference. At least in this case, you went for just if it's the same in terms of statistical lives, I don't think it makes a real difference. I think that that's a fair interpretation. And why do I draw that interpretation, although there was a cost? Because life and death is supposed to be really, really important. And if it were, by activating the trolley, you're introducing complete equality in the exposure to risk of life and death for individuals. And it's correct to apply our notions of fairness and equality to matters of risk. Surely in that case, it would have been very, very urgent, very important to activate the trolley, and something as trivial, after all, as preventing 10 minutes of headache should not have swayed you to neglect to activate the trolley. Since you so facilely chose, as I would, to refrain from activating the trolley, I think that what's going on here is probably that it's just incorrect to apply justice to the distribution of risks. I'm an egalitarian myself. I like equality. I think that justice has a lot to do with equality. I apply my equality to outcomes, not to chances. I apply it to things like I want people to have, as far as possible, and of course not every cost, but at some cost, I want people to have equally good and thriving and long lives. But that's an outcome. They will have had equally good lives. It's not chances for these outcomes. I think that justice doesn't apply there. That's my position. It's very open to considerations like the, say, consequential considerations the norm mentioned. It's perfectly open to somebody like me to say, but there are some policy reasons to take into account, to give some priority to identified persons in certain contexts at least. What I want to deny is that they have some intrinsic claim on us, that there is something inherently already problematic whenever somebody's at higher risk and identified as such to give them some priority. So this book is, I wanted to end by saying, part of a broader series, and I have here copies if somebody wants to look at. These are my copies, so I think I'm not authorized to sell you them. Of the first book in the series and the third book in the series, the kind of opus magnum by Dan Hausman, maybe his best book to date is coming out next month. If any of you have projects in population-level bioethics and thinking about bioethics not at the micro level, not at the clinical level, how should the doctor treat the patient, but rather how should the system be organized, how philosophically should we approach these issues with implications to law and other practical areas, then approach me, approach my co-editor Dan Wickler at the Public Health School, because we are keen to have additional volumes in the future. So should we open it to questions?
So now you're going to come over here. We're going to open up to questions. Do we need? So I'll ask our AV specialist. Do we need the mic in this room, or are people's questions, will they be heard?
What's important is a thriving
Okay.
area of philosophy
I guess maybe one question about the logical structure of this, and one question about the intuition tap and the pills example. So maybe start with a general observation that bounded search is useful in all sorts of contexts and is efficient in all sorts of contexts, whether we're talking about individual decision-making or institutional decision-making. And so if, right, we wouldn't want, it would not be socially optimal to have a physician faced with a sick patient in the middle of the day's practice start wondering whether there aren't better ways for that physician to spend his or her time, right? Maybe I could go do preventive things, maybe I could lecture, maybe I could go get a bunch of other kids turned on to medicine, maybe I should go to Wall Street, make a lot of money, and just give the money to Doctors Without Borders. Right, we don't want that. And so part of what I'm wondering is how much wrestling in the book there is with the question of frame problems and when it might or might not be useful or optimal to generalize a bounded search procedure, like help the person in front of you. With the pills thing, I mean, I understand the intuition, but just change it so that it's a needed organ coming in. A needed organ coming in for transplant, right? And so we've got a present certain life. The organ comes in, hey, we've got this organ, and we've chucked all of the structures we have about organ donation because we think they're suboptimal. And a transplant surgeon is there. He says, look, I've got this patient, Jim. He's a good candidate. He needs this organ. Let's just go to the OR and do it. There's another attending standing right there and says, look, on the ward, I've got 10 more people just like Jim. I can get their files. I can get their names. There's no medical difference to the 1 minute delay. Let's go. And, you know, if we don't have time to really sort out who's the better candidate, we're just going to put the names in the hat and pick one. Is your intuition that Jim is still the right choice?
Let me say a word as Norm ponders it, 'cause I can see deep thinking. You can see the hamsters running. Let me say a little something about your first question about framing, right? So this is a perfectly good strategy, which is to say the identified lives is a bias. It's a bias that in some settings there are consequential reasons why we might like the bias to be in place, but there's no there. It's not that we think that if we think if the doctor were to do this or the legal service provider were to take a moment and say, what's the population of people I might help versus not, right? Bad things may come of it, but it's not as though deep down we think that there's any more reason to help the person in front of you than others, right? It's a contingent fact about the world, and we'd want to just ask whether that is the view of people who think that it is a bias. Some of our biases are heuristics, right? They're useful in everyday life, and we want to leave them in place. But that is opposed to the opposite view is that no, not only this is not just a contingent fact of the world that it's good to operate our lives this way, but actually you're doing something morally wrong if you took the other perspective that's not connected to the contingent facts of the world and the consequences and friction costs and emotional views.
I get that. I'm just wondering how much this is teased out and looking at the various examples. So if you're asking about just justiciability, right? I understand the problem, right?
Yeah.
Certain sorts of things won't get addressed, and maybe they're things we want to
Yeah.
address, right? But I also want to know about the cost to a certain sort of solution.
Yeah, and again,
what might go wrong there, and the extent to which you've teased those out.
Yeah, and again, in this paper, all I want to suggest is that here's an area of law that people don't think about in these terms, but actually this very debate is kind of, and there are reasons why as a heuristic you might prefer it. But I'll let Norm also weigh in on the Oregon case, and maybe Nir has something to say about the framing question too.
No, I didn't want to say something about the framing question because I don't think the book actually talks about framing in a very significant way. I'm not quite sure I understand your example because it seems to depart from the Peel case in a very significant way, because we don't have any characterization of the risks that these patients on the ward face. Are they going to die without the transplant? What is happening? So I'm not sure there's a way to test this intuition. Let me respond to the argument that chances or risks are not the issue that we ought to pay attention to. If you all know that in walking outside, think back a month, a large icicle might fall from the roof and hit you in the head and send you to the hospital. Forget whether you're going to die or just need a brain transplant. Do you think you're worse off if you're face that risk or not? And the intuition that I was playing on is that those risks are relevant to thinking you're worse off than if you don't take risks into account. The argument that I made about the Pill case was that if you think that that Alice is worse off because she faces a 100% chance of dying compared to the others who face only a 20% chance of dying, then one ought to take that into account.
It seems you're not isolating the statistical life there, but the degree of chance. So
that's what I said. I was talking about the concentration of risk. Is that relevant?
Okay, sorry, because in the sense of the environmental concerns or the here versus there concerns, the transplant case, we could say, look, they're all in dire straits, they're all at risk of dying soon, and it's a present life versus some population from which we're going to save someone and lose 9. I mean, that seems to me to be.
So I think Nir wants to say something about this case. Then there's a few other people who want to talk, so we should try to get.
So I'll just say that I think that Norm is not defending the view in the sort of philosophically least costly way, because he's now further grounding his position of sympathy towards people who are at higher risk by saying we should count them as worse off. And that is a further premise that I think it's actually easy to level criticisms against. So usually we think that if somebody was yesterday worse off than the others, say yesterday we distributed cake and they didn't get as much cake as the others, they have a nice claim on us today to, maybe if today we're distributing a cake, today is their turn and they should. So he would maybe have to say, if it turns out that unbeknownst to anybody, somebody was at high risk over the past week, so we didn't know, they didn't know, nobody was psychologically affected by this, but there was this icicle near them that almost fell on them. It did not. Then we owe them now compensation for the fact that they were at high risk if we find that out, even maybe if now they're faring much better than the rest of us. And that to me is doubly counterintuitive. I don't know if Norm wants to endorse that, but I bet most of you would not want to say people are owed compensation just because, unbeknownst to anybody, they passed by some snake that failed to bite them, of course, but it could have bit them or something like that.
Refraining from the compensation argument is a piece of the story and not the whole of how one evaluates the level of risk and whether you're worse off when you face the risk than somebody who doesn't. So I think you are worse off. So if I knew that I had 50 times the chances of being hit by lightning that you do because I'm wearing an iron suit or something like that, or I'm a lot taller, then that would be a cause of concern to me. And it doesn't matter that I took the suit off some time ago. I was, it could be that we don't look at the history of the risk in the same way that we would.
And interestingly, in the law, there is a doctrine known as loss of chance, where, again, the counterfactual is you would have gotten the error anyways, but you would have had a better chance of avoiding it, and sometimes we actually do compensate for loss of chance in medicine. But I think there's another question.
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask a question to Glenn, probably. So, is there, do you think, any way to resolve this conflict between identified and statistical lives with respect to like all branches of law? So should we say that not only in civil procedure and environmental law, but also in constitutional law, criminal law, the law of torts, we should favor identified lives or you should favor statistical lives? Because, for example, in criminal law, you could say that when it comes to crime and punishment, it also focuses on identified lives. You need to find a victim who has suffered a tangible harm. So could you say that, well, this is also a bias and we should also, what we should in fact do is to say, well, we should prevent the society from these crimes to happen and we should more focus on statistical lives. Thank you.
So in this normative debate, I am closer to Nir's side, I think, in that I don't think there's any extra moral force to being an identified life versus a statistical life. And so if law does favor the identified lives, and when it does in general, I would want to have not so much an error theory, but an explanation as to why and what the considerations are. I mean, one thing that's interesting is you could also have dummy lives, right? So we could construct, if we think people are susceptible to this bias, you could create fleshed out stories of people who never really exist, right? Television characters and stuff like that, and think about them and think about what would happen if so-and-so did bring a lawsuit, right? Should, when you're testing whether a particular law should be this way or not. It's interesting that in the way we teach law, we're kind of somewhere in between when we spin out hypotheticals, that we often do put some flesh on the bone, but it may be that we don't put enough flesh on the bone in the typical lawyerly moment. And I think there might be very good reasons, prudential reasons the Supreme Court has offered as to why you want somebody who has a real stake in the case and has really developed facts to be litigating. All I wanted to do in my paper is kind of identify this descriptively of an area where the prudential concerns actually interface with this philosophical debate. But there may be other intermediate steps like the class action one could imagine on the policy side as ways of trying to bridge the gap a little bit. But I don't see any reason why the law ought to favor identified lives in general.
As a matter of policy, however, we do, for example, in funding police forces and so on, try to reduce the risk of violent crime and the like. So we may be facing a division of labor between the courts, which might be better at some things than others. And we might want to reduce the risk of violence in some contexts. Why are we doing that? We might have in mind that we want to protect statistical lives. So even if the courts don't do it, we might have another area of public policy that does.
I think we probably have time for at least one more question. Let's see. Oh yeah, we'll do this one, and then we'll get one of the authors in the book, Casper Hare, after you, Matt. So we'll take the two questions and we'll give answers.
I'll cut
to
my
them.
question in half. I'll just ask: does this distinction matter for this debate, either Glenn or kind of on the ethical side, between risks for which we know the source of the risk and kind of how it came to be? Maybe it was thought of by a philosopher, or maybe it was due to the poverty of the person who's subject to the risk, or something. We can actually tell the story of why the risk came to be, and risks for which we really don't know the story. Does that matter at all, either in deciding whether or not to privilege identified lives or in thinking about class treatment?
So it's an interesting question. I don't know if you two have thoughts. I mean, I will say in the book, having read through the whole book several times, that people have both kinds, that there's some very interesting gumball examples of like roulette wheels and stuff like that, and there are other cases where it's unexplained or a meteor will hit, and then there are times when people are the cause of risks. I think that if to the extent we have intuitions about retribution or about compensatory justice, it may be that those are triggering certain reactions to certain cases, but I see no reason why this debate strikes me as orthogonal to the source of the risk. But I don't know what you two think on that question.
we have a very different reaction to certain kinds of caused risks than we do to others. And it may be because we think we can control them in various ways that we can't others, and we might have reason to want to control them.
I would say, however, that it's not clearly two completely separate topics. So suppose somebody throws a stone off of Empire State Building because they want to kill somebody, versus somebody who murders a particular individual, maybe because of some particular characteristics of that individual. One of the reasons to extra punish the latter person is in terms of maybe empathy towards the family of the murdered person, which maybe one could argue we have sort of greater reason to do in case number 2 than in case number 1, because somebody targeted them for attack, and it's extra urgent to clarify he was a perfect member of the community, that should never have happened, because so that we clear any doubt that they were subhuman or something of that sort.
Okay, so I think we had time for one more question. You said from Professor Hare.
Hi. So yeah, Nia, I just wanted to focus on your example. So you elicited what seemed to be an intuition, what the majority of people see apart, that at least in some context, the identified victim effect was not morally significant. But I wondered, in the example you used, there was one potentially distorting factor that may have influenced people's judgments, which was that it appears as if you spin the roulette wheel, then you'll end up killing someone, because there'll be somebody who's dead as a result of well, there's at least a 99 out of 100 chance in your example that you'll kill someone if you spin the roulette wheel. Whereas if you don't spin, you merely let the identified person die. Yeah. And of course, people's judgments are notoriously sensitive to exactly that distinction. So insofar as you elicited that, we want to make sure that it wasn't that people were caring about the difference between killing and letting die. So you might try a different sort of example, well, similar kind, but one that doesn't have that feature. Namely, imagine that there are 2 trolleys, and they're heading towards a mass of people. And one of them, you can stop one, and only one of them. You can only stop one of those trolleys. And one of them is headed towards a track towards some unknown to you victim, but it's one of the people. And the other is heading towards a track with a junction box on it, which is attached to a roulette wheel. And, as it passes through the junction box, the roulette wheel spins, right? And with objective chance, right? 1 in 100 shuffles off to any one of 100 places, right? And so the issue is you can stop one of those trolleys, which one of them do you stop? And let's suppose that we attach a slight cost to your stopping the trolley that's going through the junction box with the roulette wheel attached. Suppose, we attach a slight cost. Well, which one do we want? We want to attach a slight cost to your saving the identified person, right? So we attach a slight cost to your stopping the trolley, which is going to track to hit a particular person. And then the issue is, again, do people feel, in that case, and that's like perfectly now neutral with respect to killing and letting die. Sure. And now I wonder if you ran the question again, I mean, you can try it, if people are clear about the case, if people still feel that you should take the
So let me just ask for a clarification. If I do
I'm not
nothing...
sure we're going to have time for that. Why don't you, I think maybe we may have to leave that hang. No, it's okay. As a thought, because we have to finish up, and we also want to announce the name of the winners. We can do that first, then we can have applause for both us and the winners. So first, let's get, everybody, by the way, at the moment is a statistical winner, but you're going to be identified winners in a second. Oh, wait.
Everybody's also a statistical loser.
Well, I wouldn't want to put it that way, Nora, but that's accurate. Schrodinger's cat no longer. Oh, I get to do this.
We kill the losers. We didn't.
Okay, there we go. Shall we read them out? Michael Dwyer, come on down. Magdalena Tabor, come on down. Philip Lassan, come on down. And lastly, Kartike Mahajan, come on down. A big round of applause. And please thank me, please join me in thanking my co-editors and also thanking the library and thanking the authors.